At first glance, some lives look like they are moving in one direction only, upward, fast, and unstoppable. But behind the spotlight, reality often tells a very different story. Today, we're stepping into the life of a man who appeared to have everything perfectly aligned. Yet behind the scenes, his journey has been marked by unexpected challenges, emotional weight, and serious health struggles. Welcome to Celebs Discovery Files, where we uncover the deeper truth behind celebrity lives in a simple and human way. There was a time when everything in his life seemed to be falling into place. His career was growing, his public image was expanding, and his work was reaching new levels of recognition. From the outside, it looked like success without limits. Audiences were captivated, opportunities were increasing, and his presence in the entertainment world was becoming stronger with each passing moment. But life doesn't always follow a predictable path. Sometimes, when everything appears stable, the most unexpected challenges begin to surface. And in this story, that is exactly what happened. Without warning, his life took a turn that would change everything. What started as a single health issue quickly became something much more serious. At first, it may have seemed like a minor concern, something temporary, something that could be managed, but over time the situation didn't improve. Instead, it escalated. What followed was not just one isolated problem, but a series of medical challenges that continued to return again and again. Each new issue brought new uncertainty. Each recovery was followed by another setback. And just when it seemed like he had finally overcome one obstacle, another one appeared. This cycle created a level of pressure that is difficult to fully understand unless you've experienced something similar. It raises an important question. What happens when someone's body becomes the biggest obstacle in their own life? When the very thing that allows them to work, perform, and live starts to fail them, how do they continue moving forward? To understand this, we need to look deeper into where his journey began. Because long before fame, long before public attention, and long before these health struggles, there was a simple beginning. A quiet childhood in a small town where everything seemed normal on the surface. But even in those early years, something was different. There were moments, small at first, that didn't fit into a typical understanding of reality. These moments were confusing and at times overwhelming. They didn't come with explanations, they simply happened. And one particular moment would go on to shape everything that followed. As a young child, he experienced something that felt deeply real and impossible to ignore. It wasn't something he learned from anyone else. It wasn't something that could be easily explained. It was a feeling, a sense, something internal that seemed to point toward a future event. At the time, he didn't have the language to understand what was happening. He couldn't explain it clearly, even to himself. But the experience was strong enough that he tried to share it with someone close to him. What followed would turn that moment into something unforgettable. Just as he expressed what he was feeling, reality aligned in a way that was difficult to dismiss. The event he had sensed suddenly became real. For a child, this kind of experience can be confusing, even overwhelming. It challenges the way you understand the world and your place within it. That single moment marked the beginning of a lifelong question. What was this experience, and why was it happening? From that point on, his life was no longer ordinary. He began to notice patterns, impressions, and feelings that didn't match what others around him were experiencing. While most people went through life focusing on the present, he often found himself sensing things beyond what was immediately visible. This created both curiosity and confusion. On one hand, there was something fascinating about it. On the other, there was uncertainty, especially because there was no clear guide or instruction on how to understand or control it. As he grew older, the impact of these experiences became more noticeable, not just internally, but externally as well. The people around him began to react in different ways. Some were supportive, while others were unsure, and some even reacted with doubt or concern. This is where the real challenge began, not just understanding himself, but being understood by others. Because when someone experiences something that falls outside of normal expectations, It can create distance. It can lead to questions, skepticism, and sometimes even judgment. And for someone still trying to figure things out, that can be difficult to carry. At a young age, he was already dealing with something most people never have to think about. He was trying to understand something that didn't have clear answers, while also trying to live a normal life at the same time. This created a unique internal conflict. On one side, there was the everyday experience of growing up, school, friendships, challenges. On the other side, there was this unusual ability that didn't seem to fit into any normal category. And as time went on, this contrast only became stronger. Instead of fading away, the experiences continued. Instead of becoming clearer, they became more complex. And instead of being fully accepted by everyone, they often led to more questions than answers. But this was only the beginning, because what happens next in his life would take everything he experienced as a child and bring it into the public eye. It would transform a private struggle into a very public journey. And it would introduce him to a world where belief, doubt, and curiosity all exist at the same time. As his story continued, the early experiences that once felt confusing began to shape his teenage years in a powerful way. What started as small, unexplained moments slowly turned into something more consistent, something that could not be ignored. By this stage, he was no longer just a child trying to understand a strange feeling. He was becoming a young person trying to navigate a life that didn't feel ordinary. Teenage years are already a difficult phase for most people. It is a time filled with identity struggles, social pressure, and the need to fit in. But for someone experiencing something so different from those around him, that challenge becomes even more intense. Instead of simply focusing on school and friendships, he also had to deal with questions about himself that had no clear answers. There was curiosity, but also fear. There was a desire to understand, but also a pressure to hide or control what he was experiencing. Not everyone around him understood what he was going through, and that created distance in some situations. Some people were open-minded, but others were skeptical or unsure how to react. This difference in perception created an emotional weight. On one side, there was a growing sense that he might have something unique. On the other, there was the reality that being different can sometimes lead to isolation. That balance between acceptance and doubt became a constant part of his life. During this time, he also began to explore his abilities more actively. Instead of keeping everything to himself, he started to test and understand what he was experiencing. This wasn't done in a formal or structured way. It was more personal, more experimental, and more based on intuition than instruction. He would sometimes share his impressions with others, and in some cases those impressions seemed to connect with real-life details. These moments didn't go unnoticed. People around him began to take interest, not just out of curiosity, but also because of the emotional impact these interactions could have. This is an important part of his journey. Because regardless of what people believe about his abilities, there is no denying that his presence had an effect on those around him. Whether it was through comfort, reflection, or emotional connection, something was happening that drew people in. As his confidence slowly grew, so did his willingness to explore this path further. He wasn't rushing into anything. Instead, he was taking small steps, learning as he went, and trying to understand how to manage both his personal life and this growing aspect of his identity. At the same time, he was still a teenager. He had responsibilities, schoolwork, and the normal challenges that come with growing up. Balancing these two parts of his life was not easy. There were moments of doubt, moments of confusion, and moments where everything felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of clarity, moments where it felt like things made sense, even if only for a short time. Moments where his experiences aligned with something meaningful, and moments where he began to realize that this was not something that would simply go away. Instead of trying to ignore it, he began to accept it. Acceptance didn't mean full understanding. It didn't mean he had all the answers, but it meant acknowledging that this was a part of who he was, whether he fully understood it or not. As he continued through high school, word about his abilities began to spread. What started as small, personal experiences slowly turned into something more public. People began to talk, not in a large global sense at first, but within his local environment. This attention created new opportunities, but also new challenges. Being different in a close environment can sometimes lead to both interest and criticism. While some people were drawn to him, others were uncertain or even skeptical. This is where his journey started to shift, because now he was not only trying to understand himself, but also how to exist in a space where others were observing and reacting to him. During this time, something important happened. He began to use his abilities in a more structured way. Instead of random experiences, he started to offer readings. These were simple at first, shared with classmates and people he knew. But even in these early stages, the impact was noticeable. People reacted emotionally. Some were surprised, some were comforted, and others were left thinking deeply about what they had experienced. This emotional response is important because it shows that his work was not just about information, it was about connection. As more people became aware of what he was doing, the attention slowly increased. What started as small interactions began to grow into something larger. He was no longer just a student exploring something unusual. He was becoming someone people looked to for guidance, comfort, and insight. This transition did not happen overnight. It was gradual, but it marked a significant turning point in his life. At this stage, he was still young, still learning, and still figuring things out. But the direction of his life was becoming clearer. He was moving toward a path that combined personal experience, emotional connection, and a growing sense of purpose. At the same time, this path came with responsibility. Because when people begin to rely on you for emotional support, especially in sensitive areas like grief or loss, the weight of that responsibility can be significant. It is not something that can be taken lightly, and he seemed to understand that. Instead of rushing forward without thought, he continued to grow carefully. He didn't claim to have all the answers. He didn't present himself as perfect or fully in control. Instead, he allowed himself to learn and evolve over time. This approach helped him build trust, not just in his abilities, but in his character. People didn't just respond to what he said, they responded to how he carried himself. And that made a difference. As we move forward in this story, we begin to see how these early experiences and teenage developments led him toward a much larger stage. A stage that would introduce him to a wider audience, new opportunities, and even greater challenges. As his journey continued, the path that once felt personal and private began to shift into something much larger. What started as small local experiences slowly opened the door to opportunities that would place him in front of a much wider audience. This was the moment when his life began to change in a way that he could no longer control or contain. Word of his abilities began to spread beyond his immediate environment. What once stayed within a small circle of people started reaching new ears, including those in larger, more influential spaces. This kind of attention doesn't happen overnight. It builds gradually, one conversation at a time, one experience at a time. And with that attention came opportunity. At a relatively young age, he was introduced to individuals who saw potential in what he was doing. These weren't just casual observers. They were people who understood how the entertainment world works, people who recognized when something unique had the potential to grow into something much bigger. This marked an important shift, because now he was no longer just practicing or exploring privately. He was being guided toward a professional path, a path where his abilities would be presented to a much wider audience, in a more structured and public way. This transition wasn't simple. Stepping into a larger spotlight comes with new challenges. There is pressure to perform, pressure to meet expectations, and pressure to maintain consistency. For someone still learning and growing, this can be overwhelming. But despite the pressure, he continued forward. With support from those around him, he began to take on more structured opportunities. Private sessions turned into more formal engagements. Local interactions gradually evolved into something more organized and visible. His work was no longer just personal, it was becoming part of a larger platform. One of the most significant turning points in his journey came when he was introduced to a wider entertainment environment. This exposure allowed him to reach audiences he never would have encountered otherwise. It also placed him in situations where his abilities would be tested in new and more public ways. And this is where things became even more interesting, because moving into a public space doesn't just bring opportunity, it also brings scrutiny. Every action is observed, every moment is analyzed, every detail can be questioned. This duality, attention and criticism, became a constant part of his life. On one side, there were people who were deeply moved by what they experienced, people who felt comforted, understood, or emotionally impacted by his work. On the other side, there were those who approached everything with skepticism, questioning how it was possible and whether there was another explanation. This balance between belief and doubt became a defining feature of his public journey. Despite this, his presence continued to grow. His work began to reach more people, and his name started to gain recognition in wider circles. With that recognition came new opportunities, including the possibility of appearing on larger platforms. This was a major step forward. But it also meant stepping into an environment where expectations were higher and where every detail mattered. In this space, there is little room for uncertainty. Everything is observed closely, and every moment is part of the public record. During this time, something else happened that would significantly impact his life. He faced a serious medical emergency. This moment was completely unexpected. There were no warning signs that prepared him for what was about to happen. It came suddenly, forcing everything to stop. In an instant, his focus shifted from career and growth to survival and health. This experience was a turning point, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. For someone who had spent a lot of time exploring the concept of life and death, this moment brought a new level of understanding. It was no longer something to think about or discuss. It was something to experience directly. Being in a situation where your life is at risk changes your perspective. It makes everything feel more immediate, more fragile, and more real. Plans become less important. Priorities shift, and the way you see your own existence begins to evolve. During this time, he was under strict medical care. The situation was serious enough that movement needed to be limited, and the risk of complications was high. This added a layer of fear and uncertainty that is difficult to fully describe. But through this experience, something important happened. He survived. Recovery became the next phase of his journey. And while the physical healing process takes time, the emotional and mental impact lasts even longer. Experiences like this don't just pass, they stay with you. They change the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you approach life moving forward. After recovering, he returned to his work with a different perspective. He was still doing what he had been doing before, but now there was a deeper understanding of how fragile life truly is. This realization added depth to his work, because now it wasn't just about what he was doing, it was about why he was doing it. And as his career continued to grow, so did the scale of his audience. His work reached new platforms, and his name became more widely recognized. This expansion brought new opportunities, but also increased scrutiny. Every appearance, every statement, and every interaction became part of a larger conversation. And within that conversation, there were always two sides: those who believed in what he was doing, and those who questioned it. This ongoing debate would continue to follow him throughout his career. But despite that, he remained focused on his path. He continued to work, continued to grow, and continued to move forward. As his career continued to rise, the next phase of his journey placed him in front of an even larger audience. What once began as small, personal interactions had now evolved into something that reached homes across the country and beyond. This level of exposure brought both opportunity and pressure, and with it came a new level of responsibility. At this stage, his work was no longer just about individual experiences. It had become part of a larger public conversation. People from different backgrounds, beliefs, and perspectives were now watching, analyzing, and reacting to what he did. This kind of visibility changes everything. It adds pressure, but it also creates impact. With this growing attention, his career reached a defining moment, a moment that introduced him to millions of people at once. This exposure didn't just increase his popularity, it also opened the door to more complex discussions about his abilities, his methods, and his intentions. As his presence expanded, so did the reactions. On one side, there were people who found deep meaning in his work. For them, his readings offered comfort, closure, and emotional support. These experiences were often described as powerful and life-changing. They connected people with memories, emotions, and reflections that helped them process loss or uncertainty. On the other side, there was skepticism. Questions began to emerge. How does he do it? Is there another explanation? Could it be something more grounded in observation, psychology, or preparation? These questions became a central part of the discussion surrounding his work. This duality created a unique environment. Every appearance became more than just a moment. It became a topic of analysis. Every interaction was examined, replayed, and discussed. And every reading had the potential to spark both belief and doubt at the same time. One of the most interesting aspects of this situation is how both sides can exist simultaneously. Some people walk away feeling emotionally connected, while others walk away questioning everything. And yet, both responses are part of the same experience. This tension became a defining element of his career. As the scrutiny increased, so did the pressure to perform consistently. Being in the public eye means that every detail matters. There is little room for error, and even small moments can become points of discussion. This level of visibility can be both rewarding and exhausting. Behind the scenes, the work itself required focus, energy, and emotional strength. Each interaction involved engaging deeply with others, often in moments tied to grief, loss, or unresolved emotions. This kind of work carries weight. It is not something that can be done casually or without emotional impact. Over time, this emotional weight began to build, because while he was helping others process their feelings, he was also absorbing those emotions himself. This creates a unique dynamic. You are not just observing or listening, you are participating in deeply personal moments that affect both sides. And that impact is not always easy to carry. As his career progressed, he also began to expand his work into other forms. Instead of only focusing on live or private sessions, he explored different ways to connect with people. This included sharing his experiences, reflections, and insights in a more personal format. This allowed people to see a different side of him, not just as a public figure, but as a person trying to understand his own experiences. It created a space where he could express himself more openly, while also offering others a chance to understand the meaning behind his work. But even with this expansion, the debate around his abilities didn't slow down. In fact, it intensified. There were critics who analyzed his methods in detail, looking for patterns or explanations that didn't involve anything beyond human observation. They suggested that careful listening, subtle cues, and psychological techniques could explain the results people were seeing. One of the most commonly discussed ideas is something known as observational technique, where a person uses reactions, body language, and responses to guide a conversation. In situations like this, small details can become meaningful over time, especially when combined with intuition and communication skills. This perspective doesn't necessarily dismiss the emotional impact of the experience. Instead, it offers an alternative explanation for how the results might be achieved. And this is where the conversation becomes complex. Because regardless of the explanation, the emotional response remains real for the people involved. Whether someone believes the experience is supernatural or psychological, the feeling they walk away with is often genuine. This is why the discussion around his work continues to exist. It sits in a space where belief and skepticism overlap, where emotional experiences and analytical thinking meet, and where people are left to form their own conclusions based on what they see and feel. At the same time, his career continued to evolve. He reached new milestones, expanded his audience, and continued to work on projects that reflected both his personal experiences and his professional growth. With each step forward, the balance between public attention and personal challenges became more important than ever. because as his visibility increased, so did the demands placed on him. Maintaining a career in the public eye requires consistency, resilience, and adaptability. It also requires a strong sense of self, especially when faced with constant analysis and feedback from a wide audience. And throughout all of this, one thing remained constant: his commitment to his work.